At my daughter's wedding, standing at the podium, my son-in-law raised his glass toward me and said, "Someone get the truck driver a coffee," then had me seated at the last table out of sight. So, I wouldn't ruin the atmosphere. He kept talking. The guests kept laughing. I didn't respond. I simply sent one message from my phone. 5 minutes later, every powerful person in that room, including him, received the same notification. Then the venue speakers came alive. "This wedding will be canceled in 15 minutes. Then the entire room went still. Welcome. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from today. One quick note, certain details in this story have been shaped for narrative depth and reflection. Names, places, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real situations is coincidental, but the lesson at the heart of it, that part belongs to all of us. My name is Frank Callahan. I am 61 years old. I am the founder and managing partner of Callahan Capital Partners, a private holding firm based in Nashville, Tennessee, and the man in the white suit just made the most expensive mistake of his life. I want to be clear about something before I explain the rest. I am not a man who tells stories for the pleasure of telling them. I was raised by a man who believed that words without function were noise, and I have carried that principle into every room I have ever entered. So, when I say that Derek Voss's 11 words cost him everything, I mean that numerically. I mean it with the precision of a closing document. I mean it the way my father meant things without decoration and without revision. Callahan Capital Partners manages a current portfolio valued at approximately $1.2 billion across 14 operating companies. In March of this year, I finalized a syndicated capital commitment, the largest single transaction of my career, totaling $3.8 billion. I am the sole authorized signatory on that commitment. No capital moves without my signature. No partner enters without my approval. I built that structure over 30 years, and I built it the way my father taught me to build anything from the ground up, with the understanding that what you build has to carry more weight than you planned for, because something always arrives that you did not expect. $300. That is what my father earned in a week at Consolidated Fabrication for the last 11 years of his working life. I built Callahan Capital from a $40,000 inheritance and 30 years of not forgetting where that number came from. I have never forgotten it. I keep the pay stub, the last one he ever received, in a frame above my desk in the Nashville office. It is not there as a reminder of how far I have come. It is there as a reminder of the only standard that has ever mattered to me, that a man's word and a man's work should be the same thing. Indistinguishable. Non-negotiable. Derek Voss understood money. I will give him that. He understood how to move in rooms that contained it, how to dress for it, how to speak the language of people who had built it. What he did not understand, what I have found that a certain category of person consistently fails to understand, is the difference between proximity to capital and ownership of it. Derek had spent 6 years cultivating proximity. He had never once built anything. Let me be precise about what 11 words cost him, not metaphorically, numerically. Before that afternoon ended, Derek Voss had lost his freedom, his financial future, and the woman he had spent 6 months treating as a transaction. The 11 words he spoke into a lapel microphone, which had been live since 6:30 that morning, were recorded, cataloged, and delivered to 12 people who had already seen documentation that made those words not a surprise, but a confirmation. A confirmation is a different kind of evidence than a revelation. A revelation can be contested. A confirmation simply closes a file. I want to tell you something about what it is to sit in a room where you already know the outcome. There is a specific kind of stillness that comes with it. Not peace, I would not call it peace, because the situation did not warrant peace, but a kind of operational calm. Walter believed that the most useful thing a prepared man can do while a situation unfolds is nothing. He said it about machinery. He said if you have serviced the engine correctly, your job during the run is to observe and not interfere. I have applied that principle to rooms for 30 years. October 11th was the most important room I had ever not moved in. Why was the founder and managing partner of a $3.8 billion capital operation sitting at the last table near the kitchen door with no nameplate and a cup of coffee that nobody ordered for him? That is exactly the right question. And the answer to it is the reason Derek Voss is not a free man tonight. Table 14 was not assigned to me. I chose it. I chose it 7 weeks before the wedding date was finalized, and I chose it because of where it sat, in relation to the 4 camera positions the east corridor exit, and the primary sound system speaker that covered the front 3/4 of the hall, table 14 was not a seat, it was a position. I did not come to my daughter's wedding as a father who had lost control of the situation. I came as a man who had spent 6 months ensuring that control was the one thing nobody else in that room possessed. Harwick Industrial Holdings had been on our radar for approximately 8 months. But this was not a boardroom. This was my daughter's wedding. And Derek Voss had been on my radar for exactly 6 months, beginning 3 weeks after the largest deal of my career was announced in the financial press. To understand why that timeline matters, you need to understand how I got into that room in the first place, and why table 14 was the only seat in that room that mattered. I left Nashville at 6:15 in the morning. Route 96 was quiet at that hour. No traffic, no weather, just 40 miles of Tennessee road, running west through country I have driven enough times that it no longer asks for my attention. I kept the window cracked 1 inch against the cold, and I did not turn on the radio. I want to tell you something about how I was driving that morning. Not the route, not the speed, the attention. My hands were at the lower arc of the wheel, relaxed present the grip my father used, which I have apparently inherited without ever deciding to. I noticed it somewhere around mile 20, and I left it exactly where it was. Some things you inherit, and then you simply use them the way you use a tool, without remembering when you first picked it up. I arrived at Grandview Manor at 6:47. The gates had been open since 6, and the venue crew was still arranging chairs in the main hall when I walked through the entrance. The woman at the door checked her list when I told her my name and my role, father of the bride. She paused for exactly half a second before she said, "Of course, right this way, sir." The half second told me everything I needed to know about how my name appeared on the guest list, or did not appear as the case turned out to be. Grandview Manor was built to perform permanence. Antebellum stone magnolia arrangements, windows tall enough to make an afternoon feel like an occasion. The ceiling in the main hall was original plasterwork from 1927, and the chandeliers cast light at the angle that makes everything beneath it look like it was meant to be remembered. None of it had been designed with the Callahan side in mind. The no nameplate table near the kitchen service door confirmed that. Derek's coordinator had arranged every surface in that room, the flowers, the seating chart, the lighting rigs. The stage configuration and not one item on the list had been requested from or received by me. I had been written out of the room's acknowledged narrative so completely that when I set my coffee cup down at table 14 and looked at the blank space where a name should have been, I almost admired the thoroughness of it. Almost. I ordered coffee from the service station near the kitchen door and sat down. 4 camera operators in black polo shirts were positioning broadcast equipment across the hall. 2 above the stage on ceiling mounts 1 on a rail along the east wall, 1 at the rear, covering the full-length shot. I watched the east wall operator thread cable through the ceiling bracket, checking his sightline to the podium twice before locking the arm. A venue coordinator in a gray blazer moved through the hall with a tablet speaking quietly to the crew. She stopped near the sound station at the front left corner, checked the board, and confirmed the level on the lapel microphone that had been clipped to the podium since 6:15 that morning, left running after the sound level test. The indicator light steady red in the half-light. Martin Odom had been in the building since before I arrived. 47 years old, former Army Corps of Engineers. The kind of man whose stillness in a crowded room reads as furniture until the moment it doesn't already position near the sound equipment at the front left corner. A coffee in his hand, watching the cable crew work. We did not speak. I looked at him once. He looked at me once. That was the entirety of what needed to be said. I thought about my father, not his words. Walter Callahan was not a man who led with words. He was a machinist at Consolidated Fabrication in Clarksville for 35 years, the same plant, the same floor, the same press line for most of it. And what I remember most clearly about him is not anything he said, but the way he moved through a space he knew well, unhurried, accountable to every person in it. He died in October 2013, 12 years ago, and I had been thinking about him with increasing frequency as October arrived this year. I had not yet understood why. I would understand it by the end of this day. I settled in at table 14, both hands around my coffee cup, and waited. The question was never whether I would act. It was whether Derek would give me the right moment. I had been watching him long enough to know that men like Derek cannot help but create the right moment, the way a machine running past its tolerance eventually announces the fault all on its own. 6 months ago, I found out exactly why I had been right. And it started with a phone call I was not expecting from an investigator I had hired 3 weeks earlier, with a number that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my daughter's engagement. The pattern goes back at least 4 years, Mr. Callahan. 3 engagements. None of the families recovered the capital. I had been sitting at my desk for 17 minutes when those words arrived. The office was quiet. Nashville in April has an early morning stillness light through glass. The street below, not yet fully awake, and I had been holding the phone without speaking for long enough that the investigator had simply continued. The way professionals do when they understand that silence from the other end means keep going, not stop. I want to be accurate about something. I had suspected Derek Voss for 3 weeks before I commissioned the investigation. Not suspected in the way a man suspects whether loosely without evidence. Suspected in the specific documented way that a 30-year career in capital management trains you to suspect a pattern of timing, a sequence of proximity, a set of questions that arrived in the wrong order and from a direction that did not add up. The phone call did not create the problem. It confirmed it. That is a meaningful distinction, and I want you to hold it, because it changes what everything that follows actually was. What I was doing in that room on October 11th was not revenge. It was completion. Have you ever received a phone call that answered a question you had been afraid to ask? I do not mean a question you were curious about. I mean a question whose answer either way was going to cost you something, and you had been circling it for weeks, because asking it out loud made it real in a way that waiting did not. That is the specific texture of 9/17 on the morning of April 14th. I asked him how certain he was. He said certain enough that I recorded everything before I called you. I set my pen down, and I did not pick it up again for the rest of that call. The investigator's name I will not give here. What I will tell you is that he had been recommended to me by a former federal prosecutor who owed me a professional courtesy, and that in 14 years of practice he had worked 41 similar cases. He used the phrase predatory positioning. He meant a deliberate strategy of identifying families with significant near-term liquidity events, inheritance transfers, deal closings, IPO lockup expirations, and inserting a relationship into the window between announcement and distribution. Derek had done this 3 times before Natalie. Each time the engagement had lasted long enough to secure a verbal capital commitment. Each time a clause in the relationship's financial structure had made recovery functionally impossible. I wrote one word on the folder, Voss, no date, no subtitle. My father labeled things that way. One word at the machine shop, motor-bearing shaft, nothing more than the thing required. He used to say that extra words on a label were a sign that the man who wrote them was not sure what was in the box. I was sure. I had been sure for 3 weeks, and now I had documentation. Below my window, a delivery driver was unloading boxes from the rear of a white panel truck. Unhurried, methodical. Each box lifted with the particular economy of a man who has done the same motion enough times that it no longer requires his full attention. He stacked 4 boxes on a hand truck, secured the strap, and moved toward the building entrance without looking up. The street around him was beginning to wake a coffee carts, a woman walking fast with a shoulder bag, a traffic light cycling through its sequence for no one in particular. I watched all of it for approximately 90 seconds, and then I turned back to the folder. The total unrecovered capital across Derek Voss's 3 prior relationships was $460,000. I want you to sit with that number. Not because it is large in the context of the deal I had just closed, it was not large, but because it was precise. An investigator who gives you a round number is estimating. An investigator who gives you $460,000 has traced the wire transfers. I had already understood what Derek was attempting. That number told me he had already attempted it successfully multiple times against families who did not see it coming until it was too late to act. Natalie's name had not appeared in any of those 3 prior cases. I had not yet determined what she knew, or whether she knew anything at all. That uncertainty cost me more than the $460,000 ever could. I held the phone face down on the desk and looked at the framed photograph of her on the corner shelf, taken at the opening of her architecture firm's first independent project 3 years ago, laughing, holding a rolled blueprint with both hands. The photograph was there because she had given it to me herself, with a note on the back that said, "In case you forget what good work looks like." I had not forgotten. I counted 90 seconds. It is a habit from my father, from the factory floor, from the days when a machine broke mid-run, and a foreman had to decide in silence whether to shut the line or keep it moving. 90 seconds of no talking, no moving, only looking at what was actually in front of you. He said most men made their worst decisions in the first 30 seconds of a problem, because they were still responding to the noise of it rather than the fact of it. At 90 seconds, I opened the left drawer and picked up the second phone, the one I kept there, the one I had not used in 6 months, the one that had only one number saved in it. I dialed. It rang 4 times. No answer. I put it back in the drawer and locked it, and I told myself that no answer was also information. I told the investigator to keep watching, not because I doubted what I already had, but because a man like Derek Voss deserved to be caught with something he could not explain away. The drawer stayed locked. The second phone stayed in it. I had made the call, received the silence, and filed it the same way I filed everything else in those months, as a fact without a conclusion attached. Something to return to when the surrounding facts were dense enough to give it context. I was not ready to give it context yet. I had work to do first. The work took 3 months. I want to be precise about what that means, because 3 months of deliberate preparation does not look like 3 months of urgency. It looks like nothing. It looks like a man going to his office, taking his calls, attending his quarterly reviews, and having dinner on Tuesday evenings with his daughter, who does not know that the folder on his desk has her name in the tab index 1 entry down from the word view foul. Have you ever had to watch something go wrong and say nothing, not because you couldn't speak, but because speaking too soon would cost you everything? I had watched the Voss folder move from 1 inch thick to 2.5. I had reviewed transaction records from 3 prior families, cross-referenced timelines, confirmed that the interval between Derek's first contact and his formal proposal correlated within a 30-day window of each family's announced liquidity event. This was not coincidence. Coincidence does not repeat with that precision across 4 separate cases. What I was looking at was method. Patience is not the same as inaction. He built engines for 30 years. He never tightened a final bolt until every other bolt in the assembly was seated, torqued, and checked twice. The man who hurried the last bolt because he was tired of waiting was the man who pulled over on the side of the road 6 miles later and stood there in the rain wondering what went wrong. I did not intend to stand in the rain. By late June, I had everything I needed to move to the next stage. I called Victor Langley. Victor Langley, 58 years old, senior partner at Langley and Frost LLP, the kind of attorney who reads every paragraph aloud in a room because he has learned over 3 decades exactly which paragraphs his clients will skip, had worked with Callahan Capital for 11 years. I told him what I had. I told him what I needed. He did not ask me why I had waited 3 months before calling him. He asked me how much time we had before the wedding. I told him. He said enough. We spent 4 weeks drafting the prenuptial agreement. Victor wrote the first 3 paragraphs to satisfy the standard expectations of the document, reasonable, conventional, the kind of language that reads as thorough without reading as threatening. Then he wrote paragraph 4. Paragraph 4 was 11 lines long. It had taken 4 separate drafts to get the language precise. Derek did not read a single one of them. The signing was in July in Victor's offices on the 14th floor of the Frost Building on Commerce Street. The conference room had a glass table, leather chairs, and a credenza along the south wall with a coffee tray that nobody touched. Victor read the document paragraph by paragraph in the measured cadence he used for every signing, not slow enough to signal anxiety, not fast enough to invite skimming. Derek sat across the table with one ankle crossed over his knee, nodding at intervals, with the practiced ease of a man performing due diligence without actually conducting it. His phone rested face up on the table to his right. When Victor reached paragraph 4, he read it in full. Paragraph 4 defines conduct, triggering full forfeiture of any financial benefit derived through the marriage. Victor set the language out cleanly, clause by clause, every subordinate condition included. Derek looked at his phone once during the reading, then back at Victor. "Sounds thorough," he said, without looking up from the page he was not reading. "It is," Victor said, and set the pen down beside the signature line. Derek signed at the bottom of page 9. He did not turn back to page 4. He capped the pen, set it on the table, and extended his hand to Victor with the unhurried confidence of a man who has just completed a formality. Victor shook it. I sat across the table and said nothing. My father used to say that the most dangerous bolt in any engine is the one the mechanic assumed was already tight. Not the loose bolt, not the missing bolt, the one that looks right. that passes a visual inspection that nobody double checks because everyone in the room believes someone else already did. Derek Voss had just become that bolt. He had looked at the document, decided it looked thorough, and signed it on the basis of appearances. As Victor collected the papers, Derek's phone screen lit briefly in his palm. A notification, one line, no preview. He glanced at it, dismissed it with his left thumb, and dropped the phone into his jacket pocket. The gesture took less than 2 seconds. I noted it the way I noted everything in that room, without expression, without comment, with the full understanding that I would need to know what that message was before October. I found out in September. The message had come from a man who was standing in the building's lobby at the moment of the signing, a man I had known for 22 years, whose name I had not yet entered in the Voss folder, but whose presence there answered the question I had been carrying since April, when the second phone rang 4 times, and no one answered. He signed without reading paragraph 4. People rarely read paragraph 4. That tends to be where everything important lives. Greg Hartwell and I go back 22 years, and the most useful thing he ever taught me, he taught me by accident on the day he left. Greg Hartwell, 54, former partner at Callahan Capital. A man I trusted for 22 years and whose quiet exit in 2020 cost me $600,000 and produced something far more valuable than money, was not a dishonest person in the way that word is usually meant. He did not lie to me directly. He did not forge a document or move money without authorization. What he did was more precise than that. He read the partnership agreement carefully enough to identify the one clause that would allow him to exit without triggering the buyout provision. And he structured his departure around it, quietly, methodically, in a way that left me absorbing a shortfall that no contract language had anticipated, because I had written the contract assuming the partnership would end by conversation, not calculation. He didn't steal from me. He simply arranged for the loss to land on my side of the table. I want to be accurate about how I responded to that, because the accurate version is not the version most people would expect. I did not call Greg. I did not write a letter. I did not consult an attorney about remedies or send a message through a mutual contact suggesting I was considering action. I absorbed the $600,000, updated the Voss folder's predecessor, a file I labeled simply with Greg's initials G.H., in the same way my father labeled parts that needed attention, and I began rewriting every partnership and capital agreement in my portfolio from first principles. How do you prepare for a betrayal from someone who has never given you a reason to prepare? You do not prepare for it specifically. You prepare for the category. My father built engines. He did not design a bracket to compensate for one specific bolt that had worked loose once. He redesigned the bracket to hold under any load from any direction with or without the bolt. That is the only kind of preparation that functions across conditions you cannot predict. After Greg, I spent 8 months making my legal infrastructure the kind of bracket that holds regardless of who sits across the table. $600,000 is a significant tuition. I paid it without a word and filed the lesson where I keep the things I intend to use. By 2021, the rewritten agreements were in place. By 2022, they had been tested twice in smaller disputes and had held both times. By 2023, they had become standard practice for every new engagement at Callahan Capital, reviewed annually by Victor Langley, updated when the regulatory environment required it. I did not think about Greg Hartwell for 2 years. I thought about the system he had inadvertently helped me build. The investigator said Greg's name on a Tuesday morning in July. I had not heard it in 2 years. It arrived like a bill I had already paid arriving again from a different address. The investigator had found Greg's number in Derek's outgoing call log 4 times across a 6-week window. Not in Derek's contact list under his name, under a single initial 1 letter, filed the way a man files something he wants to be able to deny knowing. I sat with that information for the length of my morning coffee, and then I pulled the GH folder from the cabinet in the credenza behind my desk. It had not been opened since 2021. The paper inside was the off-white of documents left undisturbed long enough to acquire the smell of a decision someone hoped would not need revisiting. I set it on the desk beside the Voss folder and looked at both of them for a moment. There is a thing that happens when a pattern completes itself. Not a feeling exactly more of a structural recognition, the way an engineer looks at a load diagram and understands without calculating that the bridge will hold. What Greg had done in 2020 was teach me at $600,000 worth of instruction that the only counter to a document used as a weapon is a document filed first file correctly. and file before the other party understands that filing has begun. I had learned that lesson. I had applied it in July when Victor and I wrote paragraph 4. When Greg's name appeared in Derek's call log, I did not contact Greg. I did not alter the plan. I did not add a layer or remove one. I activated the same legal protocol the GH exit had produced already. Written, already filed, already positioned, and I noted in the margin of the investigator's report. In the same single-word style my father used at the machine shop, one word handled. Greg Hartwell had handed me the exact tool needed to contain his own return. He had done it 5 years earlier, without knowing he was doing it on the day he arranged for the loss to land on my side of the table. A sealed exit is not a trap. It is a courtesy for people who would rather not see where the door was until it is too late to use it. I have never set a trap in my professional life. I have built frameworks and waited for people to locate the edges of them on their own schedule. The frameworks do not require me to be present at the moment of contact. They only require that I built them correctly. I gave nothing away, and I drove to Grandview Manor on a Saturday morning in October with every exit already sealed. Task 3.1. The night before the wedding, my phone rang at 10:47, and the investigator did not say hello before he said her name. I had been sitting in the study with the overhead light off the window, cracked an inch against the October air. The city's ambient glow coming through the glass in the way it does in Sylvan Park when the street has gone quiet. I was not waiting for the call. I was not expecting it. The investigation had produced its last scheduled report 3 weeks prior, and I had considered the file closed enough to move. I answered on the second ring. Rachel Dunn, 29 years old, a name I was hearing for the first time at 10:47. On the night before my daughter's wedding, delivered in the flat voice of an investigator reading from a verified report, was 3 months pregnant. The child was Derek's. I did not respond immediately. I held the phone against my ear, and I listened to the investigator explain the timeline, a relationship that had overlapped with Derek's engagement to Natalie by at least 5 months, documented by hospital registration records and a lease co-signed in August. The investigator read these facts the way professionals read facts they wish they did not have, without inflection, without pause, moving through each item at the pace of a man who understands that speed is a form of mercy. I have received difficult news before. I have absorbed losses that would have ended other firms made decisions at 2 a.m. that could not be undone by morning. But the investigator's voice that night had a specific quality, the flat professional tone of a man delivering facts he wishes were not facts. And I recognized it because I have used that same voice myself in rooms where I was the one with the report and someone else was the one holding the phone. When the first item was finished, I asked about Greg. 4 months of contact, he said, consistent, coordinated. I asked him to confirm the overlap with Derek's engagement timeline. He did. I asked him if the communication pattern suggested awareness of the wedding date. He said yes. I told him thank you. I ended the call. The phone screen held its light for a moment after I set it face up on the desk, then dimmed to black. The framed photograph of Natalie was on the shelf to my left, the one from her firm's first independent project 3 years ago, laughing, holding a rolled blueprint in both hands. I did not look at it for a long time. When I did, I looked at it the way you look at something you have looked at so many times it has become furniture, and then you look at it again and it is not furniture anymore. You might ask why I did not call Natalie that night. I have thought about that question more than any other question in the month since October. The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable, and I am not going to dress it in language that makes it easier to hear. The answer is this. If I called Natalie that night, she would not walk down the aisle in the morning. If she did not walk down the aisle, Derek would know the framework had been detected. If Derek knew the framework had been detected, he would instruct Greg to move whatever he intended to move, dissolve whatever he intended to dissolve, and leave Natalie with the wreckage and no recourse. The only protection I could give her was the one that required her not to know she was being protected. I understood that clearly. Understanding something clearly does not make it weigh less. The leather of the armchair had the settled warmth of a chair that has been sat in through many evenings, and I held both armrests, and I did not move. The study held the smell of cooled coffee and old paper, and the faint metallic edge of October air through the cracked window. Outside, a car passed on the street, and its headlights moved across the ceiling and were gone. A neighbor's dog made one sound and went quiet. I sat in that chair for 40 minutes. The house did not make a sound, neither did I. At some point, the decision stopped being something I was making and became something I had already made. I have noticed that about decisions of a certain weight, the moment you recognize them is usually not the moment they occur. They occur somewhere in the silence, and you arrive at the recognition afterward, and the recognition feels like understanding something that has already been true for a while. The wedding would proceed exactly as planned. Every camera in position, every document filed, every exit sealed in the specific and architectural sense that I had spent 6 months constructing. Derek would walk into Grandview Manor tomorrow with everything he believed he had arranged, and he would walk out of it with none of it. That was not cruelty. That was the only shape the protection could take. I picked up the phone and dialed Martin's number. It rang twice. "Tomorrow," I said. "Stay close." He said he understood. I believed him. I always have. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid of what was coming, but because I already knew exactly what it was. After the call to Martin, I sat at the kitchen table. Not at my desk, not in the study. The kitchen table, the one my father had eaten breakfast at on the mornings he visited. The one Natalie had done her university coursework at, on the winters she came home. I sat there with the overhead light off and my hands flat on the surface, and I did not think about the morning's sequence, the camera positions, or the documents. All of that was done. Every piece of it had been done for weeks. There was nothing left to review. What I thought about was Natalie. I want to be clear about something. I was not afraid that night. I want you to understand the difference between a man who cannot sleep because he is uncertain and a man who cannot sleep because he is not. Uncertainty has a particular texture. It moves, it circles it, generates questions that manufacture other questions. What I was carrying that night had no movement in it at all. It was entirely still. The stillness of a thing already decided, already irreversible, already aimed at the morning with the particular momentum of 6 months of work pointed in a single direction. I was not afraid. I was sitting with the cost. There is a version of the story where Natalie comes home in June, and her father sits her down at this same table and tells her what he knows. I looked for that version for a long time that night. I looked for it with the specific attention I give to problems I want to solve, running the sequence forward from the conversation and checking its outcomes against the facts. If I told her in June, she would have needed time. Time creates the possibility of visible change. Visible change alerts a man like Derek to the presence of a plan. An alerted Derek calls Greg. Greg moves. Whatever was intended to be moved gets moved. And what my daughter is left with afterward is the knowledge of the betrayal and none of the structural protection against its consequences. I had looked for a version where she knew. It does not exist. The kitchen held the smell of the evening residual coffee, the dry wood warmth of a house that has been heated through many winters, the faint cold beginning to come in at the edges where the window frames had started to settle with age. I sat there until approximately 3 in the morning, and then I moved to the back porch. My father worked a machine that ran hot all winter, a press line that required monitoring by proximity rather than instrument. You held your hand near the housing to feel whether the temperature was within range, close enough to register the heat, not close enough to burn. He said that was the only reading that mattered, not the gauge, not the manual specification, but the sustained knowledge of what right felt like from the inside of the process. I had been holding my hand near this for 6 months. I knew the temperature of every component. I knew what the morning was going to feel like before it arrived. The back porch in October at 3 in the morning has the specific quiet of a world not yet committed to the day. The Nashville horizon held its ambient glow, but the sky above the yard was still fully dark. No suggestion of what comes before dawn. No transitional light. I sat in the porch chair with my hands in my lap, and I listened to the silence of a street that had finished its night and had not yet begun its morning. A car passed somewhere 2 blocks over. A bird made one sound early, confused by something, and went quiet. She called me Dad in the announcement. Not father, not Frank, Dad. She was 29 years old, and she still called me Dad, the same word she had used at 5, at 12. At 22, when she graduated and found me in the audience and said it across the distance the way people say words they know will carry. I had been the person that word was addressed to for 29 years. That night I was also the person who had decided what she would not know until it was too late to prevent any of it. The hardest thing a man can do is nothing and mean it. Walter said that once and never needed to say it again. Not nothing as avoidance, nothing as discipline. Nothing as the conscious, sustained decision to hold your position when every instinct tells you to move because you know that moving will cost more than staying still. I had been doing nothing for 6 months in that specific sense. I had been doing nothing every time she called. Every dinner, every Sunday, every time she told me something about the wedding arrangements with the particular voice people use when they are certain they are building something real. I stayed on the porch until the sky began to change at the far edge, the first gray suggestion of a morning that was going to arrive, whether I was ready for it or not. Then I went inside, put on the coffee, and stood at the kitchen window and watched the light come. I didn't sleep because I had been certain for months. I didn't sleep because I knew exactly what the morning was going to cost my daughter, and there was no version of this where that part didn't hurt. Well, task 4.1. That's 12. I drove to Grandview Manor alone the next morning, 40 miles of Tennessee hills, going gold in the October light, and I did not turn on the radio. Route 96 at that hour asks nothing of the driver. The road simply runs, and I let it. I kept the window cracked against the cold, and I did not think about the night before, not because I had resolved it, but because I had already decided what the morning required. And the morning was what I was driving toward. I had made a decision at the end of the driveway. Not a spoken decision. I did not pull over and tell myself anything. It was the kind of decision that happens in the body before the mind registers it the moment I turned onto Route 96. Everything from the previous night went into the same drawer where I keep the things I have already processed and will not revisit until the situation calls for it. The grief was real. It was going into the drawer. The morning required something else. A lesson from the factory floor. The last thing you do before you strike a bolt is stop moving, stop adjusting, stop measuring, stop second-guessing, and just hold the position. He said it about machinery, but he meant it about everything. I had been adjusting and measuring for 6 months. The bolt was ready. I held the position for 40 miles. I did not think about the documents on the drive. I did not run the sequence or check the positions. All of that was done. What I thought about instead was the work itself, not its components, but its nature. 30 years of building things that hold. 30 years of not confusing proximity to a standard with the standard itself. That was the only inventory I needed to arrive with. Let me tell you what a venue looks like at 6:45 in the morning, 2 hours before a wedding, when you are the only non-operational person who knows exactly what is going to happen inside it. It looks completely prepared and entirely unaware. The flowers are in position, the chairs are dressed. The lighting has been set at a level calculated to make 700 people feel like they are inside something significant. Every surface that can be polished has been polished. The room is built for an event it does not know has already been decided. Walking through it at that hour is like walking through a theater before the audience arrives. The stage is set, the cues are loaded, and the actors do not yet know which of them will leave the building with something they came in with. I pushed through the main door at 6:47. The manor smelled of fresh-cut flowers and polished wood, and the particular conditioned air of a building that has been climate-controlled overnight for a special event, cool and deliberate. A scent that belongs to rooms built to perform significance. My shoes on the carpet were quiet. The hall was not empty. 2 crew members were running a final cable check along the east wall, and a venue coordinator was speaking quietly into a headset near the stage. But it was empty in the way that matters: no guests, no ceremony, no one performing anything for anyone yet. I walked the hall's perimeter once. Not quickly, not with purpose that would draw attention. The walk of a man who has arrived early and is simply orienting himself. I noted each camera position without looking directly at any of them. East wall rear center 2, above the stage on the ceiling mounts, all active indicator lights steady. The soundboard at the front left corner showed the lapel feed live. The archive stream timestamp was running in the upper corner of the monitor. The microphone on Derek's lapel had been live since 6:30. He had put it there himself, the venue's premium Groom package audio option, selected and fitted by Derek's own coordinator as part of the morning preparation. That is not irony. That is a man building his own record without knowing the record has an audience. I completed the perimeter and came to a stop at table 14. I did not sit. I stood at the table's edge and looked across the length of the hall to where Martin Odom was positioned near the sound equipment, coffee in hand, watching the cable crew finish their work. He was standing the way he always stood, in operational spaces, weight slightly back, completely still. The posture of a man who has already identified every exit and has no reason to move until he does. He looked up at the same moment I looked at him, 40 feet of empty hall between us. Martin Odom gave me one nod from across the hall, the kind of nod that means everything is running, everything is ready, and there is nothing left to do but wait for the room to fill. The first car turned into the lot at 7:14. It was Greg Hartwell's. By 7:45, the hall was taking its shape, the full chair rows, facing a stage that Derek's coordinator had designed entirely without a single conversation with the Callahan side. I had been at table 14 for approximately 40 minutes by then. I had ordered coffee from the service station near the kitchen door, and I had not moved from my seat. I did not need to move. I had walked the perimeter at 6:47, and I had seen everything I needed to see. What I was doing now was something different. Not surveying, not checking. Watching the room assemble itself around the architecture I had built inside it, and noting the specific irony of each new arrival who walked through the door without knowing they were stepping into a mechanism rather than a celebration. Greg Hartwell had come through that door at 7:14. I knew he was somewhere on the property. I did not look for him. A watched man adjusts his behavior to the attention. An unobserved man follows his plan. I had my own plan to follow, and it required exactly the posture I was already in, seated still, unremarkable. The father of the bride at the last table near the kitchen door, with a cup of coffee and no nameplate. Look at the room for a moment. Really look at it. 700 chairs filling with people who had received a wedding invitation and arrived expecting to witness a marriage. Not one of them, with 12 exceptions in the front 2 rows, had any understanding of what the room was actually configured to do. The floral arrangements were real. The chandeliers were real. The occasion being performed for the cameras was not the occasion the cameras were recording. I watched the chair rows fill with the specific patience of a man who has nothing left to arrange. The hall's ambient noise was building in the way large rooms build individual conversations, accumulating into a general hum, the frequency rising slowly as capacity approached. The sound of a full room becoming something larger than the sum of its parts. I noted the 4 camera positions without directing my gaze at any of them. I noted the VIP section taking shape in the front 2 rows, the seats Derek's coordinator had assigned, with the apparent belief that proximity to the stage communicated importance. Derek's coordinator spent 6 months designing a room intended to impress the most significant people in Derek's professional world. I have wondered sometimes whether she understood what she had actually built. The front 2 rows held names I recognized from every capital table I had sat at in the past decade: institutional investors, board members, managing partners from 3 firms whose capital I had worked alongside for years. Each of them had received a personal invitation from Derek's team, a gesture I understood now that was meant to signal legitimacy. Look at who has come to celebrate with us. Look at the room I can fill. It was a performance of credibility assembled from people whose actual understanding of Derek Voss extended no further than his name on the invitation. The obscured corner table back left, partially hidden by a column, the venue coordinator had apparently not considered when assigning seating had a clear line of sight to the front row aisle seat on the left side. That was the seat I was interested in. Owen Pressfield, 56 Silent Capital partner, the kind of institutional presence who says nothing in a room and is heard by everyone in it, was already in it. He had arrived at 7:38, taken his seat without looking for me, and opened the program that had been placed on each chair by the venue staff. He read it with the unhurried attention of a man with no urgency, which is the specific performance of a man who has been prepared and is waiting for the sequence to begin. Owen Pressfield had been in the front row of this plan since May. Not since the prenuptial signing, not since the final investigator report. Since May, 2 months into the investigation, when I had enough documentation to understand what I was looking at, and enough trust in Owen's judgment to brief him before I had briefed anyone else. He had asked 2 questions. He had needed no instructions beyond that. He needed only a seat, and Derek's coordinator had given him the best one in the house. I set my coffee down and looked at the room as it completed itself. 700 chairs occupied, or nearly so. 4 cameras running, 1 archive stream active. 12 capital partners and board members in the front 2 rows, every one of them present by Derek's own invitation, assembled by Derek's own coordinator, seated in positions Derek's team had assigned. I thought about what my father said about the most dangerous assumption a man can make, that the room he has arranged is the room everyone else is experiencing. Derek had arranged a room for a performance of success. He had not considered the possibility that the room had already been arranged for something else entirely. and that the people he had invited to witness his success were seated precisely where they needed to be to witness what was actually coming. 12 of my own capital partners and board members seated in the front 2 rows, invited by the man who was about to make the worst decision of his professional life in front of all of them. Transparency, I thought. It is a remarkable thing. Then Derek walked in, and the first person he looked for was not Natalie. By 1 in the afternoon, the guests had started arriving, and Derek Voss walked into Grandview Manor wearing a white suit that cost more than most men earn in a month, and carrying the specific confidence of a man who has never been caught. I watched him from table 14. The hall had been filling for the better part of an hour by then, chair rows filling front to back. The way rooms like this always fill the people most invested in being seen arriving early, taking the front positions, settling in with the deliberate ease of individuals who have decided their presence constitutes a contribution. Derek entered from the west corridor at approximately 1:12 and paused at the threshold for a moment, not long, but long enough to be the pause of a man who has practiced it. He surveyed the room. Then he moved. What I watched over the next 8 minutes was not a man greeting guests at his wedding. It was a man conducting a room audit. Derek moved through the hall in a sequence that had nothing to do with proximity or social warmth, and everything to do with financial hierarchy. The VIP section, first the front 2 rows, the 12 capital partners, the institutional names. He reached Owen Pressfield within 90 seconds of entering and shook his hand for 11 seconds. I counted. He moved through the remaining front row partners at approximately the same rate, sustained eye contact, both hands on the handshake. The deliberate performance of a man communicating, "I know who you are, and I intend for you to remember me." He did not look at me once, not when he entered, not when he passed within 12 feet of my designated corner on his way to the VIP section. Not once. I had signed the commitment that represented 38% of his entire financial future. And I was furniture. That is not a complaint. That is a data point. A man who does not register the most consequential person in his vicinity is a man operating on an incomplete map of the territory. The white suit moved through the room with the ease of something that had been designed to be noticed. I will say this for Derek, he understood the performance of arrival. He shook hands the way men shake hands when they want the handshake to be remembered, weight in it duration. The specific pressure of someone communicating, "I am a serious person, and you are fortunate to have my attention." He laughed twice at things people said to him. The laughs were timed correctly. His voice carried to the rows behind the VIP section, without effort, which is a skill. And he knew it was a skill, which is a different thing from having it. You want to know what a man reveals when he thinks no one important is watching. Watch how he moves through a room when he believes the most powerful person in it is seated behind a column at the back. Watch the sequence of his attention, who gets the extended handshake, who gets the brief nod, and who gets nothing at all. The sequence tells you the map inside his head. Derek's map had the capital partners at the top, Natalie's family in the middle, and my corner of the room nowhere on it. The floral arrangements intensified as the hall warmed with bodies. Cut flowers in a heated room produce a sweetness that moves with the air current, and I could track Derek's cologne moving through the crowd on top of it, expensive projected. The specific scent of a man who decided that morning how he intended to be perceived. The audio hum of the hall had climbed to a register, just below conversation level, the sound of the crowd becoming one collective ambient note. I had been at table 14 for over 5 hours. I had not fidgeted. I had not adjusted my position. I had set my coffee cup down, at the same angle it had been in since 7:15, and I had not moved it. Walter had a saying about bolts: the most dangerous one in any assembly is the one that looks perfectly fine. I was watching 2 bolts in that room, and both of them looked perfectly fine. Owen Pressfield looked across the hall at me at 1:19. 2 seconds, not a glance, not a survey. A deliberate, directed look held for exactly the duration of a man confirming a fact he already knew. His expression did not change. He looked away. In 30 years of capital work, 2 seconds from Owen Pressfield is a full paragraph, and what it said was, "Everything is in order, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be." I completed my survey of the VIP section and shifted my attention to the room's perimeter, the east corridor entrance, the far end of the hall. The secondary exit point I had noted in the legal brief as the location most likely to be used by someone who understood the building's layout and needed a quiet way out. Greg Hartwell was standing there, 40 feet from the east corridor door, facing a floral arrangement at the hall's far wall, his back to most of the room. He had been there long enough that 2 guests had moved past him without registering his presence. He was not looking at the flowers. He was positioned. That is not the same thing as looking at flowers. And the difference between a man who is present at a location and a man who has positioned himself at a location is the difference between coincidence and choreography. He had placed himself in the one spot in the building that the secondary documentation covered. Greg Hartwell was 40 feet away studying the floral arrangement, like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. I noted where he was standing, and I did not move. Then Natalie came through the door, and every calculation I had made in 6 months met the one thing I had not fully prepared for. At 2:30, the venue coordinator announced the family photo session, and I walked toward it because I am the father of the bride, and that is not a position that requires an invitation. She was wearing white. She was looking at Derek. She looked the way my wife looked in 1991, and I had to stop thinking about that immediately. I took my position in the family grouping without announcing myself. Derek's coordinator appeared at my left shoulder. Within seconds, a woman in a gray blazer with a tablet and the restless energy of someone who has been told to manage variables, and she began to explain that there was a spot for me just to the left of the secondary arrangement. I did not look at her. I said, "I know where I stand." She did not repeat herself. Derek was 3 feet away during the photo session. I can tell you that his cologne was expensive, and that the white suit at close range had a visible sheen of fabric, chosen specifically to be remembered, the kind of garment selected not for comfort, but for effect, the physical equivalent of a statement made before anyone has asked a question. I can tell you that he did not look at me once during the 4 minutes we stood in the same frame for the same photographer. Not when I took my position. Not when the photographer adjusted the grouping and moved me 2 steps to his right. Not once in 4 minutes of shared space did Derek Voss register the presence of the man whose signature represented 38% of everything he had spent 6 years building toward. I noted all of this with the attention I give to any observable fact without judgment, without visible response as data added to a record that was already extensive. The photographer called for a natural expression. Several people in the grouping laughed. Derek smiled with the unhurried ease of a man who has practiced that particular expression long enough that it no longer requires effort. I looked at the camera. Then he leaned toward the groomsman on his left, a young man in a rented jacket who had been laughing on cue at everything Derek said for the past 4 minutes, and he spoke 11 words into the live lapel microphone on his own chest, at the relaxed half-volume people use when they believe they are speaking only to the person beside them. "Someone get the truck driver a coffee. He looks like he drove in from the wrong county." The groomsman laughed. 3 other people in the grouping heard it and looked at the floor. The photographer kept shooting. 11 words. That is what 6 months of preparation, a prenuptial agreement, 4 cameras, 12 capital partners, and 1 live lapel microphone had been configured to receive. 11 words delivered with the complete confidence of a man who has placed the most consequential person in the room behind a column at the back and forgotten to account for the columns having ears. I heard it. Every camera heard it. The archive stream heard it and time-stamped it at 2:33 p.m. and filed it in the cloud before the groomsman's expression had finished settling back into something neutral. The sound did not need to travel far. It was already everywhere. I walked back to my seat. I sat down. I did not hurry. I set my coffee cup at the same angle it had been at since 7:15, and I picked up my phone and opened the group message thread I had drafted in August, all 12 capital partners. One thread, one message that had been sitting unsent for 2 months. I read it once to confirm the language was still correct. It was 11 words. I have thought about that symmetry more than once since October, and I want to be honest, it was not planned. The message had been written months before, 2:33 p.m., months before Derek said anything into any microphone. Some things align without being engineered, and when they do, the correct response is not to remark on them. It is to press send. Let me tell you what it feels like to send a message that ends a man's financial future in under 60 seconds. It feels like nothing at all. It feels exactly, precisely, completely like pressing send. I set the phone face down and did not check for responses. I had estimated 5 minutes before the first visible consequence. I adjusted my coffee cup 1/4 turn, and I watched the room with the specific patience of a man who has already done the work and is now simply observing the work take effect. Claire Whitmore had been standing within arm's reach of Derek when he delivered his 11 words. I had watched her expression from across the photo, grouping a sequence of 3 distinct adjustments across approximately 4 seconds. The kind of involuntary recalibration that happens in a person's face when they understand that something they have known privately has just become public record. She was now moving back toward the bridal preparation corridor, at a pace that was not hurried, but had direction in it. The walk of someone who has made a decision and is moving before the moment. Closes? I noted her path and did not follow it. 4 minutes and 50 seconds after I pressed send Owen Pressfield stood up from his seat in the front row. A room does not look the same when 12 people who collectively manage more capital than most institutions will ever process rise from their chairs at the same moment and move in the same direction. It does not look like disruption. It looks like a physical law being demonstrated, the inevitable consequence of a sequence that was set in motion long before the room was assembled around it. Owen stood leaned toward the partner beside him, spoke 4 words, and moved toward the east corridor with the unhurried precision of a man executing a sequence he had long since finalized, in a situation that had unfolded exactly as constructed. 8 other partners followed in the next 90 seconds. A 9th checked his phone, read what had arrived, and stood without looking at anyone. I was not watching Owen. I was watching Greg Hartwell at the east corridor perimeter, 40 feet away, who had been standing in the same position for over an hour, and who went completely still the moment Owen moved, the stillness of a man who has just felt the room shift and does not yet know the full dimensions of the change. His weight moved back by a degree. His right hand traveled to his jacket pocket and stopped there, as though he had reached for something, and then reconsidered the reaching. Martin reached him at 2:40, 4 seconds. Greg's hand came out of the pocket empty. His head moved in sequence door hall floor, and the sequence was the answer to a question I had not needed to ask aloud. Derek looked up from his phone, scanned the hall, and found me. I set my coffee down and nodded once slowly across the width of the room. 2 men now understood clearly that the afternoon was not going to end the way either of them had planned for it to end. I had told you I would give you the 4 words Martin delivered to Greg Hartwell. Here they are. Your exit is sealed. Victor Langley crossed the room to Derek's table at 2:35, unhurried, carrying a white envelope the way a man carries something that does not need to be rushed, because it was always going to arrive regardless. I watched him from my seat. Victor had spent 30 years at Langley and Frost, developing the specific bearing of a man who understands that the most consequential deliveries in his profession require the least visible effort. He did not announce himself. He did not slow as he approached Derek's table, did not adjust his pace to signal importance or urgency. He set the envelope flat on the surface parallel to the table's edge, with the precise placement of someone whose work is already complete and is performing only the final physical step of a process that concluded months earlier. Then he turned and walked back across the floor at the same pace he had arrived without looking back. Derek opened the envelope with one hand. He read the first 4 lines of the first page, and his hand went still on the paper. Not a dramatic stillness, not the stillness of a man performing reaction, but the involuntary arrest of motion that happens when a person reads something that rearranges the architecture of what they believed was true. He did not turn to the second page for a considerable interval. The couple at the adjacent table glanced at him once and returned to their own conversation. I registered the stillness as a fact appended to a record that was already complete and required no addition from me. The room around us was still processing the radio announcement, generating the layered, unresolved noise of a large crowd that has received unexpected information and has not yet reached a collective conclusion about what to do with it. That ambient density was its own kind of cover, and the corner table near the kitchen corridor had become, in the volume of that uncertainty, its own private geography. Greg Hartwell sat down across from me without being invited. In 22 years, partnership meetings, capital reviews, quarterly closings, every professional occasion we had shared, he had never once sat down at a table without waiting to be acknowledged first. The fact that he did it now told me everything I needed to know about the distance between the man he had been at the signing in 2020 and the man sitting across from me at 2:37 on October 11th. He placed a folded document between us and explained it the way people explain things they have rehearsed under pressure quickly, without pausing to gauge comprehension, moving through the language as though speed itself were a form of control. The document, he said, implicated Callahan Capital in a prior undisclosed conflict of interest. If I proceeded with the conduct clause filing, the document would be delivered to every regulatory contact on my record, Both of us walk away clean, he said, or neither of us does. I let him reach the end. That was the only courtesy I intended to extend. I reached into my inside jacket pocket and placed the folded July 14th filing confirmation on the table beside his document. I said the date, nothing more. His document had been commissioned in September. I had known the week he initiated it because the investigator had been monitoring his communications since the first week of March, 4 months before Greg had decided the document was necessary. 3 months before, Derek had decided to use it as his final option. Greg looked at the date on the confirmation. He looked at it for a long time, the way a person looks at something when they are no longer reading it, but instead understanding in sequential layers exactly what it means. I said his name once, then I said go home. He stared at the filing date for 3 more seconds. Then he picked up his document, stood without speaking, and walked toward the east corridor without looking back. I watched him reach the door, push through it, and disappear into the afternoon light beyond. I did not watch what happened after that. I turned back to the room. Before I tell you what came next, if you have stayed with me this far, drop a single word in the comments right now. Tell me, would you have chosen silence or action? In that moment, I want to know where you stand. And a note before we continue, the following details have been shaped for narrative clarity. If that is not what you came for, this is a natural place to stop. For everyone still here, this is the moment the whole morning was built toward. Let me tell you what it sounds like when your own voice moves through every speaker in a room at once. It sounds irrevocable. Not loud, I did not speak loudly. The ordinary voice carries differently when it comes from every direction simultaneously. And what it carries most clearly is the quality of a decision that has already been made and is simply being announced to the people who have not yet been informed. I reached under the table and picked up Martin's two-way radio, which I had placed there at 6:47 that morning when I first sat down. I pressed the transmit key. I spoke in the most unremarkable voice I own, the same voice I use at a closing, at a quarterly review, in any room where the work has already been done. And what remains is only the stating of it. This is Frank Callahan. The wedding scheduled for 3 o'clock will not be taking place. Documentation is available at the VIP table for any partner who requires it. Thank you. I released the key. 3 seconds of absolute silence from a room that had been producing continuous ambient noise for 4 hours. I have sat in large rooms at significant moments across 30 years of professional life, and I have never heard silence occupy that much space before or since. It lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the room began to move, not in panic, not in chaos, but in the specific, irreversible way that a room moves when the occasion it assembled for has been replaced by something it did not anticipate and cannot redirect. I did not track the movement. I set the radio beside my coffee cup. I did not look toward Derek, toward the VIP section, toward the east corridor. I looked at my own hands resting on the table, and for the first time in the entirety of that long, constructed, deliberate day, there was nothing left that needed to be done by them. What arrived in that stillness was not satisfaction. It was not relief. It was something quieter and more permanent. The recognition that the hands I was looking at had been shaped by a man who worked a factory floor for 35 years and gave every person who crossed his path the same honest acknowledgement, and that everything I had built, including this morning, including this room, including the framework that had just announced itself through every speaker in a hall full of people who had come, expecting a celebration, had been built on the foundation of that single, unremarkable daily standard. My father's hands were not built for ceremony. They were built for work. I looked at mine and thought, yes, that is exactly right. Somewhere in this building, in a room I could not see from where I was sitting, my daughter was in her wedding dress. She had just heard my voice come through the wall. The ceremony had been over for 11 minutes when Rachel Dunn walked into the reception hall. I did not move. I had been standing near the east colonnade since 2:43, and I stayed there. A room in motion has a grammar to it, if you know how to read it, a syntax of bodies and trajectories and sightlines that tells you, if you have learned to read it correctly, exactly what is occurring beneath the surface of what appears to be occurring. The noise of the crowd folded into the high plaster ceiling and came back down, change softened, carrying the specific warmth of a large group of people who have been fed and given something to drink and have decided collectively to enjoy an afternoon. Somewhere behind me, a string quartet was finishing a passage I recognized but could not name. The afternoon light was coming through the tall west windows at an angle that turned everything gold and slightly imprecise. The way late October light flattens the edges of things and makes a room look like a photograph of itself. I registered all of it the way I register the ambient conditions of any space I am responsible for, not with feeling, but with the continuous, low-level attention of a man who has learned that the details a room offers before anything happens are the most accurate data available. She entered through the side door nearest the catering corridor. Not the main entrance, not the staff entry. The third option, the one that does not appear on any guest map or seating chart. The one that exists for people who have decided in advance that their relationship to a space is private rather than announced. That single navigational choice told me what I needed to know before I had confirmed her face. I had studied her photograph for 11 days. I recognized her posture first, the particular set of someone moving through a room they have rehearsed in their imagination many times, and are now navigating in reality for the first time, checking the physical geography against the mental one. She wore a pale dress positioned precisely between formal and casual, a deliberate ambiguity that allowed her to read as either guest or someone adjacent to the event's inner circle, depending on who was looking. She carried a small clutch held low with both hands, the grip of someone who needs something to hold rather than something to carry. Her hair was dark and pinned loosely. She was, by my estimate, close to 30 years old. She scanned the room once efficiently without lingering, and her eyes found Derek at the far table within 4 seconds of entering. She did not smile. She moved toward him with the efficient directed purpose of someone who has made this crossing many times in her mind and is now simply executing the physical version of it. I want you to understand what I understood, standing at that colonnade at 2:47 p.m. I had known about Rachel Dunn for 11 days. The investigator's second memo had included a verified photograph, a confirmed residential address in East Nashville, and a single date 3 months prior that established the timeline with the precision of a document that has been built to hold under scrutiny. I had read the memo twice in my study with the door closed and the overhead light on at noon, because some documents require full illumination, regardless of the hour. What the memo could not prepare me for, what no document can prepare a person for, was the geometry of watching a name become a body crossing a room. While 30 feet away, your daughter stood at a bridal party table laughing at something a friend had said. Her shoulders relaxed, her posture carrying the uncalculated ease of a woman who does not know what is moving toward her. I tracked the distance, 60 feet, 50, 45. Derek saw her when she reached 50 feet. I want you to hold that sentence and read it with care. I did not watch Derek notice an unexpected guest and make the small internal adjustments a person makes when something arrives that they did not plan for. I watched a man see something he had arranged and receive it with no visible response, no shift in his expression, no interruption to the conversation he was conducting. He turned back to his guests without disturbing the sentence he had been in the middle of, as though Rachel Dunn's appearance at the edge of his sightline was a scheduled event that required no acknowledgement beyond the fact of its occurrence. A man who does not flinch at an arrival has not been surprised by it. I noted this without expression from my position at the colonnade as a fact that confirmed what I already understood about the shape of the afternoon. I moved 2 degrees left, enough to place a column between my sightline and Derek's peripheral range. The quartet behind me had settled into something slower and lower. The room carried the combined scent of cut white flowers and warmed appetizers, and the sweetness that accumulates around an open bar in the later part of an afternoon. A server offered me something from a tray. I shook my head without looking. The marble floor beneath my shoes held its cold, regardless of how many people stood on it, and I had been standing since 6:15 a.m., and I felt the accumulated weight of those hours in the base of my spine, and I did not move. Rachel stopped 8 feet from Derek. She did not make contact. She spoke 4 words. I was positioned at the wrong angle to reconstruct the full sentence, but 2 of the words reached me clearly enough. Enough. Derek answered in a single sentence, his body still oriented toward his guests. His head turned toward her, by only the minimum necessary degree. The body language of a man performing a brief exchange with a distant acquaintance in the middle of an unrelated conversation. One of the guests said something unrelated and laughed. Derek laughed with them. Rachel turned away. The moment closed over itself, the way a surface closes over a disturbance when the disturbance is small enough and the surrounding medium is dense enough to absorb it without leaving a visible mark. I had known the outline for 11 days. I want to be precise about the difference between knowing an outline and watching it move through a room where your daughter is standing. They are not the same experience. The outline is information. The room is your daughter's shoulders, the easy lift of them. The uncalculated happiness in the line of her back, and a woman you have known only as a name in a memo crossing toward the person your daughter is about to confront on the worst afternoon of her. Adult life, and you are 30 feet away, and the only thing between that distance and a decision to close it is 6 months of work that told you staying still was the correct response. What I felt at 2:47 was not anger. It was something older than anger, and quieter, the specific recognition of a thing you prepared for that is somehow still worse than the preparation accounted for. Claire Whitmore appeared at my left shoulder. She held a glass of water toward me without speaking. She had assessed correctly that water was what the moment called for, and had brought it without being asked, which is a form of attention that most people are incapable of extending under ordinary circumstances, let alone in the middle of circumstances like these. I took the glass. I did not look at her. Rachel had turned from Derek and was moving along the outer perimeter of the room with the slow surveying movement of someone searching for a specific face. She had not found it yet. I tracked her path against the room's sightlines, cross-referenced her trajectory against the available positions, and arrived at the same conclusion from 3 separate angles. She was looking for me, and she was going to find me in approximately 90 seconds. But the door to the bridal suite corridor opened first, and what came through it changed the order of everything. The room had not finished processing Rachel's presence when the corridor door opened, and the first person through it was not Natalie. Claire Whitmore had been standing beside me at the colonnade 30 seconds earlier. She crossed the threshold at 2:48 and walked directly to the stage microphone, not in the direction of it, not with the hesitant approach of someone building toward a decision, but directly with the straight, unhesitating line of a person who made the decision before she moved, and is now simply executing the physical distance between where she was and where the decision requires her to be. She was 34 years old. I had known her for 11 years, through 100 shared dinners, a dozen holidays. The particular texture of a friendship that has survived distance and change and the slow accumulation of a decade. I had never seen her cross a room like that. She reached the microphone and stood before it without touching it for 3 full seconds, which is a duration that means nothing in ordinary time and means everything when it occurs inside the silence of a room holding its collective breath. Then she spoke. No preamble, no address to the room, no request for attention she already had. She said she had known about Rachel Dunn for 2 months. She said she had confirmed it by her own means independently through channels she did not name. She said that after she confirmed it, she had written an anonymous message and directed it to an account she believed Natalie monitored, and she had chosen anonymity because she understood, at the moment of writing, that putting her name on the message would cost her the friendship regardless of how the information was received, and she had chosen the version of honesty that preserved the lowest possible cost. To herself, she said, "That is not friendship." She said, "I am sorry." She did not elaborate. She did not look for Natalie's face in the corridor doorway, did not search the room for a response, did not ask anyone present to understand what she had done or extend mercy toward it. She stepped back from the microphone, folded her hands in front of her at waist height, and waited with the composed stillness of someone who has said the true thing and is now prepared to bear whatever the true thing costs. I have been in rooms where people confess to things. I have heard apologies constructed to minimize, to redirect, to reframe the failure as a complexity rather than a choice. What Claire did at that microphone was none of those things. She named the specific geometry of her failure, not the general outline, not the softened version, but the precise and unambiguous shape of a choice she had made and had known was wrong at the moment she made it. She named it in front of a hall full of people who owed her nothing, asked for nothing in return, and did not say Natalie's name once in the entirety of what she said. That last detail told me she was not performing an apology for the room's benefit. She was delivering one to a specific person through the only channel still available to her. The hall held its silence for a second consecutive unscheduled minute. I kept both hands flat on the table and did not move. The corridor door opened again. She came through it in her wedding dress, without a veil, without a bouquet, carrying only herself. And she stopped at the precise line where the stage floor met the hall floor and did not cross it. She stood at that boundary and she looked at the room. Not the searching look of someone trying to locate a familiar face, not the overwhelmed look of someone absorbing more than they can process. The systematic left-to-right, unhurried look of someone taking inventory, assessing what is actually present in the space before committing any response to it. Her posture was straight in the way that belongs specifically to people who were told to stand correctly for so many years that they eventually adopted it as their own standard rather than a compliance. I recognized the movement of her eyes. I had seen it in my father's face every time he entered a space that contained an unresolved problem. The look of a man who wants to understand the full shape of something before he decides what to do about it, and who is patient enough to wait for the full shape to become visible. The 700 guests had gone collectively still. The string quartet stood with their instruments at rest. The room still carried the scent of white orchids and the ambient warmth of a large crowd, in a dress space identical to the scent it had held 2 hours earlier, when everything arranged within it had been organized toward a completely different purpose. The physical room had not changed. Everything inside the purpose of the room had changed entirely. I had spent 11 months building legal architecture, 6 months accumulating documented evidence, and 40 years inheriting a working-class standard that did not have a formal name, but functioned as the foundation of every decision I had made in any room I had ever entered. I had not built any preparation for watching my daughter look at a problem, the way her grandfather looked at a problem, like the answer was already present and she was simply deciding the sequence in which to address it. I did not stand. The decision to remain seated was not passivity, and it was not restraint in the sense of holding something back. It was the recognition that a man who has spent 6 months constructing every element of a room has already made every decision he was entitled to make inside it, and that the moment the room becomes his daughter's, his role changes from architect to witness. I had made decisions I was entitled to make. I had made some I was not entitled to make, and I was carrying that knowledge in the specific way you carry something you cannot set down and have not yet found the right place to put. What Natalie was owed in the next 60 seconds was the one thing I had withheld for 6 months, the space to move first without her father's hand already on the door. Her eyes moved across the hall, past the bridal table, past the quartet, past the east colonnade, across the center of the room, across the assembled faces of the crowd, who had come for a wedding, and were now present for something that did not yet have a name in any language available to them. Her gaze reached my corner of the room, and it stayed there. My daughter stood at the edge of that stage in her wedding dress, and looked at the room the way her grandfather looked at a new piece of machinery on the shop floor methodically, without rushing the assessment, determining exactly what it was made of before committing to any course of action. She had not looked at Derek. She had not looked at Rachel. She was looking at me, and the look was not a question. It was the confirmation of a direction she had already chosen. Derek reached Natalie before I did, and I let him. Because a woman who has just assessed a room with that quality of attention does not need her father to intercept the final conversation her fiancé will ever have with her. I stopped at 6 feet, not from uncertainty about what I would do if I moved closer, not from any concern about what Derek might say. 6 feet was the correct distance for a man who had completed everything he was going to do and now needed to occupy the appropriate position for what came next, present accountable, but not in the way of something that did not belong to him. Derek had his back to the room. His voice was below the carrying threshold of the surrounding ambient sound, the first operationally intelligent choice I had observed him make in the entirety of the afternoon. His posture was contained, not aggressive, the physical configuration of a man deploying the last credible argument available to him, in the knowledge that it is the last one and that its failure has no successor. I heard most of what he said. He named the components of the morning the way someone names the contents of a room they are angry to find themselves inside: the conduct clause, the cameras, the 12 capital partners seated in the front rows at his own invitation, arranged by his own coordinator, present as witnesses to something he had mistaken for a celebration. He told Natalie that the clause was not protection. It was a mechanism designed to foreclose his options before he had any opportunity to respond to them. He told her that a man who engineers a room to neutralize someone he perceives as a threat is not acting from love. He said the word control with the specific weight of someone who has spent 7 months in proximity to a man, who exercises it, and has finally identified its name. Standing 6 feet away, I want to tell you, honestly, he was not entirely wrong. The question he was putting to Natalie, whether what I had built was love or architecture, is one I had been carrying since the night before, in the study in the kitchen, on the back porch in the dark before the morning arrived. I have spent 40 years in rooms where I was certain. Standing in that hall with white orchids and suspended breath on every side, I understood that certainty can function as a substitute for honesty. When a man is unwilling to hold both at the same time, and that I had not always held both at the same time, and that this moment was the direct consequence of that. Natalie did not interrupt him once across 2 minutes and 10 seconds. She stood with her hands at her sides and her feet at the stage edge, and she looked at his face the way she had looked at the room 30 seconds earlier, not with the searching attention of someone hoping to be persuaded, not with the reactive attention of someone preparing a counter-argument, but with the measuring attention of someone who is assessing what is actually true in what they are hearing and separating it cleanly from what is not. When he finished, 4 seconds of silence held between them. Then she asked her question. She did not build toward it. She did not frame it or cushion it or give it context. 2 words before the noun. The noun. No elaboration beyond what the sentence required. Is she pregnant? Derek did not answer. 3 seconds. I counted them the way I count things, when the act of counting is itself a form of management. His silence was not the silence of a man deciding whether honesty was worth the cost of what it would produce. It was the silence of a man who had arrived at the outer limit of what language could do for him, and had nothing left to offer except the shape of an answer he was unwilling to speak. Natalie received it the way she has always received information she already possessed, with the complete absence of visible reaction that belongs to someone who asks the question not to learn the answer, but to watch the answer confirm itself without assistance. Then she looked past his shoulder and found me. The look lasted 2 seconds and carried the weight of a conversation we had not yet had and would not need to have in the same form after this moment. It was not a question, and it was not a request. It was the look of a woman who has completed her own assessment and is acknowledging briefly the presence of the person who built the room she just walked through. I held her gaze. I did not nod. I did not speak. I closed the distance between us. 2 words. After 6 months of preparation, 4 cameras, 12 capital partners, a signed prenuptial, a counterfiling, a retired federal circuit judge positioned in a VIP section, and a radio announcement that had moved through every speaker in the hall, 2 words were what I had. They were the only 2 that carried no architecture, no strategy, no calculation. The only 2 that were simply plainly entirely true. I'm here. I said it at ordinary volume directed at her and no one else. She heard it. I know she heard it because her chin lifted by the specific small degree that a person's chin lifts when something they have been holding themselves against is no longer necessary to hold against. Her shoulders released by the same measure. The body knows before the mind confirms it, and her body confirmed it before either of us had said another word. She turned back to Derek. She removed the ring with a single continuous motion. Not performed, not slow. Not invested with any drama beyond the clean finality of a physical act that is simply the last step of a sequence that has already concluded. She took his right hand, turned the palm upward, placed the ring in the center of it, and closed his fingers around it with both of hers. She held his closed hand for exactly 1 second. Then she released it and stepped to stand beside me. We both looked forward. One person began to clap from somewhere near the back of the room. 2 hands at ordinary pace, not building toward anything, just present, deliberate, and alone in the silence for the 3 seconds before anyone else joined. One person clapping in a room that size is either the loneliest sound available to a human occasion or the most honest one. Standing beside my daughter, I decided without hesitation that it was the most honest. I did not look for who it was. I did not look at Derek. I did not look at the crowd gathering its response behind us. I looked forward and I thought about a factory floor in Clarksville and a man who shook every hand the same way, regardless of what the hand belonged to, and I thought she just showed them, without knowing she was showing them, without ever having been taught that there was something to show. The clapping spread across the hall, and beside me, for the first time since I had arrived at Grandview Manor at 6:47 that morning, I heard my daughter breathe. The applause had barely begun when Derek set the ring down on the nearest table and picked up the stage microphone, and I understood then that the man I had been preparing for 6 months had won. More move he had not yet made. The ring left his hand the way a chess piece leaves a board, not discarded, not thrown, placed. That single gesture told me everything about what came next. He was not acting from grief. He was not acting from humiliation. He had moved past both of those to something colder and more deliberate. And the shift was visible in the set of his shoulders and the angle at which he held the document he had produced from inside his jacket. I had been watching Derek Voss for 7 months. I had never seen him find that kind of quiet, not the quiet of a man who has run out of things to say, the quiet of a man who has decided to dismantle something on his way out the door. Natalie sat beside me. I did not stand. I did not reach for her hand. I kept my hands flat on the surface and I watched him begin to read. He read from the document with a flat, precise voice, not performing outrage, not seeking sympathy, but delivering information the way someone delivers it when they believe the information is sufficient on its own terms. He framed it as a compliance filing from Callahan Capital's own internal record. He named a position, a dollar figure, and a board authorization that had allegedly been bypassed. He told the room that the conduct clause investigation had not been a protection mechanism. He told them it had been a consolidation instrument, a legal architecture designed not to shield a daughter, but to corner a son-in-law before he had any opportunity to defend himself. He said the word architect, and I heard it land precisely the way he intended, carrying the full weight of everything he had said to Natalie at the stage edge 20 minutes earlier. He was not reading a document, he was offering a reframe. And in a room that had absorbed 4 consecutive unscripted events in under 2 hours, a reframe delivered with enough precision can function like a reset. Let me explain what a fabricated regulatory document does in a room with 4 cameras running live to cloud and 12 capital partners in the front rows. It does not need to be true. It only needs to be read aloud before anyone in the room has time to identify it. Derek understood that. So did I. A fabricated document at the right velocity creates the same initial disruption as a verified one, and Derek had been counting on the specific velocity of a wedding reception, still metabolizing its own chaos as cover for the speed he needed. He had been holding that document since before the ceremony began, waiting for the moment the room felt most resolved, so he could deploy it into the gap between resolution and consequence. It was a sound strategy. It was also 4 months too late. The 12 capital partners in the VIP section had not moved. Martin was at his position near the east wall. The 4 cameras were running, recording everything in the unbroken archive that had been running since 6:30 that morning. I stayed in my seat because there was nothing for me to do yet, and I had known for 4 months that there would be nothing for me to do at precisely this moment. I had built the response to this move in the same month. I had built the response to every other move, not reactively. Not after the fact, but in the deliberate, unhurried sequence of a man who understands that preparation is not a single event. It is a posture maintained across time. Derek had been reading for 3 minutes and 40 seconds when Raymond Holt stood up. I had estimated 4 minutes. Raymond Holt, like Owen Pressfield, runs slightly ahead of schedule. He rose from his seat in the VIP section without urgency. 71 years old, 4 decades on the federal circuit bench before his retirement, carrying the specific unhurried quality of a man for whom standing in a contested room to state a fact is no more remarkable than signing a document at a desk. He did not raise his voice. He did not address Derek directly. He did not perform the statement or calibrate it for the room's attention. He stated at the volume of ordinary conversation that the document currently being read aloud matched a fabricated financial instrument that had been submitted to 3 federal regulatory agencies and formally cataloged as fraudulent on July 22nd of this year. He named the case reference number. He said he had reviewed the original filing personally. Then he sat back down, crossed one leg over the other, and returned his attention to the front of the room with the composed disinterest of a man who has just completed a routine administrative task. Derek stopped reading. The silence that followed was unlike every other silence the room had generated that afternoon. The earlier silences had been held by people waiting to understand what they were witnessing. This one was held by people who had just understood it completely, the specific, irreversible silence of a room in which a question has been permanently answered by someone with the unimpeachable authority to answer it. A principle from the shop floor. The most important tool in any assembly is the one nobody touches until the final job of the day, because everything else has to be finished before it can do what only it can do. Raymond Holt was that tool, not invited to a wedding, positioned in a VIP section to deliver one sentence at one specific moment in a room that needed exactly that sentence and nothing more. The catalog reference date was July. The prenuptial had been signed in June. The gap between those 2 dates was not coincidental. It was the architecture of a prepared man, and I did not explain any of it to the room because the room had just heard Raymond Holt explain it for me. Derek stood at the microphone with the document still in his hand, and a hall full of people who had just watched a retired federal circuit judge reduce 7 months of his planning to a case, reference number, The room around him held the atmosphere of a space in which something structural has been permanently settled, not resolved in the emotional sense, but closed in the way that load-bearing questions close when someone with the correct authority answers them without theater and sits back down. The flowers at the center of the nearby tables were still white. The chandeliers still cast the same calculated light they had cast since morning. The room was dressed for a celebration that had become something entirely different, and it smelled of white orchids and the warmth of a crowd that had arrived expecting one kind of afternoon and stayed through another. He looked at me across the length of the hall, and for the first time since 2:30, I saw Derek Voss decide that this was over. Derek stepped off the stage and walked the full length of Grandview Manor's main hall toward my corner of the room, and every person still standing watched him do it. Because a man who has just been publicly identified as a fraud and continues walking toward the person who identified him has made a specific decision that he has nothing left to manage and intends to spend what remains. I watched him cross the floor, 40 feet of polished marble under the same afternoon light that had been coming through the west windows since I arrived at 6:15 that morning, lower, now more angled. The quality that October light acquires in the late afternoon, when it stops illuminating and starts revealing. He moved without hurrying, which was either composure or its precise imitation, and I had spent enough months watching Derek Voss to know I could no longer tell the difference from this distance. He carried a folder under his left arm, not the document he had read at the microphone, a different one, thicker, held with the particular care of something that has been waiting for the right moment since before the morning began. He had packed it knowing the regulatory record might fail. He had come prepared for the room to turn against him, and it had. He set the folder on the table between us without speaking. I looked at it for 2 seconds. Then I slid it back across the surface toward him, the same unhurried motion I would use to return any document that had already been answered. I did not open it. I did not need to. Victor had briefed me on its contents in July, 3 months before Derek transferred it from a desk drawer to a jacket pocket for a wedding he still believed he was going to survive. The folder had traveled 40 feet across a room and arrived at a table where every claim inside it had already been pre-filed against pre-documented and pre-answered in a sequence that had been completed before Derek finished drafting the first page. Every step of that walk across the marble floor was a man arriving at a conclusion that someone else had written 4 months earlier. Victor appeared at the table edge not from the direction I had assigned him, which told me he had been tracking Derek's approach from a secondary position and had adjusted his own route accordingly. He set a stack of certified filing receipts beside the returned folder with the same economy he brings to every delivery. No announcement, no explanation. Simply the physical placement of completed work in the correct location. Derek looked at the receipts. He did not ask what they were. He understood what they were, which is a different and more complete form of comprehension. Then Derek reached into his jacket and placed his phone on the table between us. Face-up screen lit the share button visible and a distribution list already populated beneath it. I want you to understand what it means to look at a phone screen and see 6 months of your daughter's private life categorized as a contingency asset filed under a heading that treats her. Conversations, her movements, her unguarded moments as instruments in a financial negotiation. That is not a threat constructed in anger. That is a record of intent constructed in advance before anyone gave him a reason to need it. Because he had anticipated needing it from the beginning and had begun collecting without waiting for the occasion. I looked at the screen. I looked at the distribution list. I looked at the share button, and I did not move. What I felt in that moment was not fear. Fear has a direction it pushes a person towards something, or away from it, and I did neither. What arrived instead was grief. Contained and precise, the grief of a man who had spent 11 months accounting for the financial and legal dimensions of another man's character, and was now looking directly at the dimension he had not fully measured. The documentation had never stopped. Not in the boardrooms, not in the legal filings, not in the private spaces of his daughter's life where no transaction occurs and no contract applies. I kept my hands on the table. I looked at Derek across the surface and I did not speak because the pause was not hesitation. It was recognition, the specific unwelcome recognition of a thing you prepared for and still did not fully anticipate. I did not see Natalie cross the room. That is the only moment in the entire day when something moved toward my position, and I did not register it in advance, and I have accepted that as part of the accurate record. She arrived at the table edge without my noticing, moving the way she had moved all day without announcing herself, without drawing the room's attention to her path, with the quiet directional certainty of someone who has already decided where she is going and requires no assistance arriving. She was standing beside me before I registered her presence. She looked at the phone screen. 2 seconds she parsed the data on the screen with a machinist's focus moving across the distribution list, the share button, the full architecture of what was being offered as leverage. Then she looked up. Not at me, at Derek. She said 2 words, "Do it." Conversational volume, no performance, no anger, no appeal to the room. 2 words addressed to one person, delivered with the complete absence of the one thing his entire framework required her to have. Derek's finger rested on the share button and did not move. He had spent 6 months building a structure that derived its entire force from her fear of it, and she had just looked at the structure, directly understood it completely, and removed the fear. An instrument with no leverage at one end is not a weapon. It is just a phone lying on a table between 2 people, one of whom no longer has anything to threaten, and one of whom was never afraid to begin with. Derek's finger stayed where it was. Natalie had not fought the leverage. She had not argued against it, or negotiated with it, or asked him to reconsider. She had simply made it weightless, which is the only response to that kind of pressure that actually works, and which I could not have taught her, and which she did not need me to teach her. I looked at my daughter, and I thought of my father's hands. Then Victor said at a normal volume from his position at the table, at edge of the officers or at the east corridor door. Derek pressed the button, and the content began distributing to a list that no longer existed into inboxes where a contractual media hold had been active since 7 that morning. I said 1 word into my phone, execute. The attorney had been on an open line since 3 o'clock, a preparation made in April for a contingency that had not yet existed in April, but that I had understood would exist if the morning unfolded the way I had built it to unfold. The hold itself was not a court order. It was something more durable and more precisely targeted at the prior written agreement with the cloud storage provider executed months earlier, with a trigger condition that had been sitting dormant in their system since the week after the prenuptial signing. Derek pressed the button and sent his content into an architecture that had been built specifically to receive it and go silent. The hold stripped the distribution before the first notification completed delivery. Natalie's phone, which she had been watching with the same focused attention she had brought to every development since 2:30, went quiet at 40 seconds. I had estimated 45. The attorney, like Raymond Holt and Owen Pressfield, runs slightly ahead of schedule. Natalie looked at her screen for a moment. After it went quiet, not with relief, not with visible reaction, with the same steady assessment she had used on everything else today. Then she looked at me. I did not explain. There was nothing to explain. The plan had worked exactly as constructed, which is not a cause for celebration. It is simply the confirmation that the preparation was sufficient, and sufficient is the only standard that matters when the work is finished. At 3:58, I heard tires on the Grandview Manor gravel. There is a sound that belongs specifically to institutional arrival, not the hurried crunch of someone running late, not the tentative approach of someone uncertain of their destination, but the measured even pace of a vehicle moving exactly as fast as something that has been scheduled and has no reason to rush. I have heard that sound at closings at filings, at proceedings where the physical arrival of an officer is the final administrative confirmation of work that was completed on paper weeks or months before. 2 financial crimes officers came through the main doors at 4 o'clock, precisely badge cases open, moving at the unhurried pace of people who are not responding to a situation, but completing one. Martin was already at the east corridor. I had not signaled him. He had been told to stay close on the morning of October 11th, and he had understood, as he understands most operational instructions, that stay close means be in the correct position before the position is needed, not after. I stood up from my seat. In the entirety of that afternoon, from the moment I sat down after sending the group message at 2:34 until 4 o'clock and 1 minute, I had not stood once. Not when Derek approached the table, not when Raymond Holt delivered his statement, not when Natalie walked through the corridor door in her wedding dress, not when the folder landed on the table, not when the phone appeared, not when the officer's tires came across the gravel. The decision about when to stand was made in April, the same way every other decision in that room was made before the occasion, for it arrived in the silence of a prepared position, without urgency and without theater. The one time I stood was for this. I want to be precise about what it means to walk across a room toward a man who is about to be taken into custody and straighten his collar before the officers reach him. It means you are not afraid of him. It means you were never afraid of him, not in the way that produces either aggression or avoidance. Not in any of the 7 months you spent watching him move through rooms as though he had already won. It means your standard is not a response to his conduct. It is yours fixed before he arrived, and it does not change based on what he did or what is about to happen to him. I walked to Derek and I straightened his collar with both hands, the same motion my father used before any conversation he did not want to have, but was going to have correctly, regardless of the cost. I leaned close enough to be heard only by him. I did not raise my voice. I said the one sentence that needed to be said, aimed in the direction of the morning's first insult. Someone should make sure you look right for whatever comes next. I stepped back. I did not watch the officers reach him. I did not need to. Natalie was standing at the main entrance when I turned. She had removed her shoes at some point during the afternoon. I did not know when, and when I saw her standing there barefoot on the stone threshold, I understood that the when did not matter. She was holding them by their straps with the loose finished grip of someone carrying something they have already decided not to put back on. She was standing in the October cold without fidgeting, without looking back into the hall, without waiting for any signal from me. When I reached her, she placed her hand in mine with the deliberate, unhesitating placement of a woman who has already determined her direction and is extending the courtesy of including you in it. We walked across the gravel together, her shoes in her other hand. The October light arriving now at the low finished angle of an afternoon that has spent itself entirely. The same hills, the same road, the same geography that had been there when I drove toward Grandview Manor at 6:15 that morning, unchanged, holding no record of the day except what we were carrying out of it. On the way there, I had been driving toward something I had spent 6 months constructing. On the way back, I was driving toward nothing in particular, and my daughter was in the seat beside me, and the radio was off, and that was more than enough. 3 days later, a journalist named Sandra Mills sent 6 words to my office phone and waited to see what I would do with them. Natalie fell asleep before we reached the state road, and the silence that followed was the first silence I had sat inside all day that did not require anything from me. I want to be precise about that distinction. Every silence in that hall had been operational. The silence after the radio announcement, the silence after Raymond Holt sat back down, the silence after Natalie placed the ring in Derek's palm and the first person in the back of the room began to clap. All of them were silences I was responsible for, silences I was inside, while also being the person who had built the conditions that produced them. This one on a state road in the October dark, with my daughter's breathing settled into the long, slow rhythm of genuine rest, was different in kind. It belonged to no one. It simply existed, and I was allowed to be in it without doing anything about it. So I did not debrief the day. I did not run the sequence or cross-check the outcomes. The filing was complete. The work had been done before it was needed, which is the only way work of that kind functions. What arrived in the silence was not a review. It was memory not chosen, not summoned, arriving the way things arrive when a man has finally stopped moving and the mind turns toward what it has been carrying all along. I was 11 years old the first time I understood that my father's handshake was not a social habit. I had been walking the factory floor with him on a Saturday morning. He went in on Saturdays sometimes to run a diagnostic on a press line that had been giving him trouble, and I watched him stop. At the entrance to greet the weekend janitor, a man named Earl who worked the early shift, and whose name I only knew because my father had introduced us 6 months prior. My father shook Earl's hand the same way he shook the plant manager's hand. Same grip, same duration. Same direct acknowledgement, the kind that says, I see you standing here, and I am not going to walk past you as though you are part of the building. I remember asking him about it on the drive home. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I have carried for 50 years without ever writing it down. Because some things stay without being recorded. A man who measures his handshake by the other man's title is telling you what he thinks a person is worth. I don't think a person's worth changes with their title, so my handshake doesn't either. He never said it again. He did not need to. He had already been demonstrating it every morning for 20 years before I was old enough to ask the question, and he continued demonstrating it for 15 years after, not as a lesson, as a practice. A daily, unremarked, unannounced commitment to a standard he had decided on at some point before I existed and had never once revised. I built everything I have on a version of that standard. Not the handshake specifically, the architecture beneath it. The understanding that how a man treats people when it costs him nothing is the most accurate measurement of what he will do when it costs him something. I have applied that measurement in every room I have entered for 40 years. I have applied it to Derek Voss for 7 months. It is not a test I designed for him specifically. It is the only test I know how to administer, because it is the only one my father ever showed me once on a Saturday morning in a Clarksville factory, in a 10-second exchange between a machinist and a janitor that I almost didn't register as significant. The Nashville skyline appeared at the edge of the windshield as Route 96 met the city limits. The hills behind me had gone flat and gray in the way that Tennessee evenings go, when the last of the October light is finished. Not dramatic, not gradual, just done. Natalie had not stirred since the state road. I kept my hands at the lower arc of the wheel, and I did not reach for the radio. I thought about Walter Callahan's last year. He retired from Consolidated Fabrication in the spring of 2013, and he died that October 6 months later. He did not have a long retirement. He did not seem to need one. What he had was 35 years of showing up to the same floor and conducting himself the same way on the first day as on the last. And that record was complete in a way that did not require an afterword. At his funeral, the man who spoke longest about him was not a foreman or a manager. It was a floor worker named Dennis who had been hired 3 weeks before my father retired and had worked alongside him for exactly 21 days. Dennis said he shook my hand on my first morning, like I had already earned it. I never forgot that. I had never heard that story before the funeral. My father had never told it. He would not have considered it worth telling. It was simply what he did, the same thing he did with everyone on every morning in every room he walked into. The story was not his to tell. It belonged to Dennis, and Dennis had been carrying it for 2 months, and it came out at a funeral because that is where things that have been carried quietly finally find their occasion. My daughter was asleep in the seat beside me. She had placed her hand in mine at the threshold of Grandview Manor with the deliberate calm of a woman who had already decided where she was going. She had stood in front of 700 people and removed a ring with the same unhurried certainty her grandfather brought to a handshake. She had not learned that from a conversation. She had not been taught it in any moment I could name or take credit for. The city lights were fully visible now, the road straightening as it entered the Nashville grid. The October dark giving way to the amber of streetlights and the ordinary illuminated business of a Saturday evening. I thought Walter would have recognized her today, not because she did something extraordinary, because she did something consistent, and consistency in Walter Callahan's understanding of the world was the only form of character that counted. I pulled into the driveway at 7:40 and did not immediately turn off the engine. I sat for a moment in the quiet of a car that has finished its purpose with my daughter beginning to wake beside me, and I thought nothing at all, which, for a man who had been thinking carefully for 6 months, felt exactly like the right way to end a day. Natalie woke as I pulled into the driveway, looked at the house for a moment through the windshield, then opened the door and got out without being asked to do anything about it. I followed her inside. The house had that stillness that accumulates over a day of absence, not cold, not unwelcoming, just waiting to be reoccupied. I turned on the kitchen light. Natalie sat down at the table, not tentatively not, with the careful movement of someone managing distress. She sat the way you sit in a room that has always been yours, without negotiating with it, without deciding whether you belong. She set her shoes on the floor beside her chair, still by the straps, and she put both hands flat on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. I made coffee. It was 7:42 on a Saturday evening, and the day was done, and the kitchen needed to be used in its ordinary way, and coffee was the ordinary thing. She did not ask about Derek. She did not ask about the legal sequence, what happened to Greg Hartwell, what Rachel Dunn's message had said, or what came next for any of the people who had occupied the last 14 hours of her life. I had been prepared for any of those questions. I had been preparing for versions of them for 6 months. She asked none of them. She asked about him, not the firm, not the deal, not the conduct clause or the filing dates or the counter documents. She looked across the table at me with her coffee held in both hands, and she said, "Tell me about your father, not what he taught you, him." I set my cup down, and I thought about where to begin, which is not something I am accustomed to doing. In professional settings, I begin with the data and I move forward in sequence. But there is no data sequence for Walter Callahan that captures the things she was asking about. The things she was asking about lives and details that do not reduce to a timeline or a figure. I told her about the Saturdays first, the mornings I walked the factory floor with him as a boy before the shift began, when the press line was quiet and the light came through the industrial windows at the angle that makes machinery look almost peaceful. The smell of the place machine oil and metal shavings, and the particular dry heat of a building that runs hot 6 days a week. The way he moved through it. Not quickly, not with the performed urgency of a man who needs to be seen working, deliberately, accounting for the space and every person in it. I told her about Earl, the weekend janitor at Consolidated Fabrication, a man I had met once and whose last name I never learned, who received the same handshake from my father on a quiet Saturday morning that the plant manager received on a Monday. I had asked my father about it on the drive home that day. He had answered once, and he had not needed to answer again, because the answer was already present in every morning he had ever walked into that building. Natalie listened the way she listens, completely without filling the pauses, without redirecting toward herself. Her eyes stayed on my face. She did not look at her phone. She did not shift in her chair. I noticed while I was talking that she had been listening that way all day, to Claire at the microphone, to Derek at the stage edge, to the hall as a whole when she first walked through the corridor door in her wedding dress. Not passive listening, active stillness, the kind that is itself a form of response, because it tells the person speaking that what they are saying is being received rather than processed for reply. I did not remark on it while I was talking. Some things are better left undisturbed while they are happening. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet in the way that a room is quiet between two people who have said the thing that needed saying and do not require the silence to be filled. The coffee had cooled a degree. The October night sat on the other side of the window, fully dark by now, the yard invisible, the street beyond it audible only as an occasional car passing at the pace of a residential Saturday. Natalie turned her cup once in her hands. Then she said, "I know. I've always known. I just wanted to hear you say it out loud." I looked at her across the table, this woman who had walked into that hall in a wedding dress and assessed it with the same unhurried precision her grandfather brought to a factory floor, who had removed a ring without theater and stood beside me afterward as though that had always been the only possible outcome. And I understood something I had not fully understood before that moment. She had not learned any of it from me. Not from a conversation I had initiated, not from a principle I had named, not from a decision I had made in front of her and labeled as instruction. She had absorbed it the same way I absorbed my father's standard, through proximity, through daily accumulation, through watching someone conduct themselves consistently in room after room after room until the standard became ambient, became structural, became simply the air that a certain kind of person breathes without noticing they are breathing it. Walter Callahan did not teach me how to hold a room. He showed me every morning what it looked like to hold yourself. And I had apparently been showing Natalie the same thing without knowing I was showing her for 29 years. I did not say any of this out loud. It did not need to be said. The kitchen held it well enough on its own. Sandra Mills sent her message at 9:40 that evening, and the world outside the kitchen arrived politely in a single text. Natalie had gone to the living room at some point after 9. I did not track the transition. One moment she was across the table, and the next, the kitchen had the specific quality of a room that one person is using and another person is present, indifferently present through a wall, occupying the same house in separate silences that do not require reconciliation. I was at the table with my coffee and my phone when the notification came. Sandra Mills's text was 6 words, with a question mark at the end. What would you want people to understand? I read it once. I set the phone face up on the table, and I looked at the kitchen wall for approximately 30 seconds, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted to say it correctly. A thing worth putting your name on is worth taking 30 seconds with. I want to tell you what I wrote to Sandra Mills. Not because I am proud of it, I am past the point in this story where pride is the right word, but because it is the only sentence in this entire account that was written for someone outside this kitchen. I wrote, dignity is not a gesture, it is a practice. And some people only understand that when someone who has been practicing for 40 years decides it is time to demonstrate it. Then I wrote, use my name. I set the phone down and I did not read her reply. At 9:55, a second notification arrived from a number I recognized from the investigator's report, listed under a name I had been carrying for 11 days. 8 words. I read them once. I set the phone face down on the table, and I did not turn it over again. Some messages do not require a reply. They require only acknowledgement, and acknowledgement can be private held in the specific way that a person holds something true that does not need to be spoken to remain true. I did not go to the living room. I did not tell Natalie what the message said. I sat with it for a few minutes in the way you sit with something complicated that is not yours to resolve and is not asking to be. The October night was on the other side of the kitchen window. I could not see the yard, but I could hear it the outdoor quiet of a residential street at 10 o'clock on a Saturday. Someone's porch light on 2 houses down. The neighborhood settling into its ordinary evening. Martin called at 10:15. We were on the phone for 11 seconds. That is the most complete professional accounting of the most consequential day of my working life. He said done. I said good. We hung up. I sat for a moment with the word done, not savoring it, not testing it, just letting it settle into the same place where everything else from the day had settled. My father would have recognized that economy. A man who spent 35 years in a factory understands that the right word at the right moment does not need company. Done. Good. 2 words that account for a full day the same way, 2 words accounted for everything that mattered at a table in Grandview Manor 6 hours earlier. Natalie came back into the kitchen at 10:45. She had changed out of the wedding dress she was in, an old sweatshirt that I recognized from years ago, something she had brought home from a college weekend and never returned, faded at the collar and worn at the cuffs in the way that clothing gets worn when it has been genuinely used. She poured herself the last of the coffee and sat back down across from me, and we stayed in that kitchen silence for a few minutes, the comfortable kind, the kind that does not ask anything of either person in it. Then she put her hand over mine on the table. She said, "I want to learn that." I knew what she meant. She did not mean the plan. She did not mean the legal architecture or the filing sequence or how to brief a retired federal circuit judge in July so that he can deliver a single sentence in October. She meant the practice, the daily standard that does not announce itself or require an audience. The thing Walter carried for 35 years and Frank carried for 40, without knowing its name until a state road in the October dark. I nodded once. I did not add anything. She already had. It had been carrying it all day, without knowing she was carrying it, had demonstrated it in front of 700 people and 1 kitchen table without instruction from anyone. But some agreements are worth making formally, even between 2 people who both already know. Some things are worth the nod. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The coffee was warm, the kitchen was lit, and my daughter was home. I have told this family story not because I am proud of every decision I made inside it, but because I believe some things are only understood when they are spoken out loud. I spent 6 months building a room that would protect my daughter. I told myself it was love. Derek, standing at that microphone in Grandview Manor, told her it was control. Standing there 6 feet away, I understood that both of us were partially right, and that the distance between love and control is one of the most honest questions a parent can carry. Here is what I would tell any father, any protector, any person who has ever watched someone they love walk towards something that looked wrong. Do not wait until the framework is the only thing left. Talk first. Build the conversation before you build the contingency. I prepared everything except the one thing that might have mattered most, a direct, honest conversation with my daughter in June, when there was still time to let her choose with full information. I chose the architecture over the honesty, and I told myself it was for her. Some of that was true, not all of it was. This is a family story about preparation, inheritance, and the cost of silence. The silence I chose was not cowardice, but it was not entirely courage either. It was calculation, and calculation, even when it works, leaves a residue that a conversation does not. If you are in the middle of a family betrayal right now, if someone you trusted is using your proximity to them as a financial or personal instrument, I would say this document carefully. Act deliberately and do not confuse patience with permission. A man who waits for the right moment is not passive, but a man who builds the entire room and forgets to leave a door for the people he loves. That man has something to answer for, even when the room works exactly as designed. I believe God places certain situations in front of us not to demonstrate our strength, but to show us where our standard has gaps. October 11th showed me mine. Don't be like me in that specific way. Protect the people you love, but let them stand inside the protection, not outside it, wondering why the door was locked. Thank you for staying with me through every moment of this. I'd genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. If you had been in my position that morning, knowing everything I knew, what would you have done differently? Would you have told her in June, or held the line the way I did? There is no clean answer, and I think that is exactly why the question is worth asking. If this family betrayal reached something in you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A note worth keeping in mind while this family story draws on themes that feel real, because they are real in the ways that matter. Certain details have been shaped and dramatized for narrative purposes. If this kind of storytelling isn't what you're looking for, no hard feelings, there's something out there that's right for you. But if you stayed until here, I think you already know this one was meant for you.